Daybreak across Nuremberg was the shade of cinders and vapor. Inside the ruins, the law palace stood as a structure which had outlasted the downfall of a kingdom. Within, the individuals who had commanded Europe anticipated the world's verdict. The lens sweeps across their expressions, goring with his haughty look. Hess lost in his insanity, Speer strained and calm, Stryker whispering hollow invocations. In the atmosphere drift the terms that characterized an era: culpability, compliance, atrocity. It is 1945 and the Nazi state is dead. But in this chamber, where chronicles pulse amidst interpretations and stillness, the resonance of authority remains. At this place, before the International Court, the concluding chapter of Hitler's rule commences. From deities to captives, the seizing of the National Socialists. May 1945. Germany had transformed into a ghost draped in soot and haze. Berlin, formerly the seat of the most terrifying empire in Europe, was currently a metropolis interred beneath masses of debris. Hitler was deceased. Goebbels had ended his life along with his kin. Himmler roamed around in camouflage, thinking he might yet negotiate for his existence. Across the meadows and the paths, millions of residents and troops were escaping toward the west, wishing to encounter the Americans prior to the Soviets, while coalition forces moved ahead without resistance during 1945. They found only deserted settlements where images of the leader dangled unevenly above bodies in Bavaria. The United States military's 36th Wing found Hermann Göring journeying in a plated Mercedes, encircled by his trunks and his narcissism. He sported a spotless outfit and brought a pouch of narcotics and a flare handgun. He gave up with a grin, certain that the partners would regard him as a peer, not a culprit. Surrounding him, the United States commanders observed the heavy commander, conscious of his drama. And the leader, they questioned. Göring lifted his brow and answered, "Deceased, naturally, but I could clarify all." In the north, Heinrich Himmler attempted to flee, masked as a policeman. He donned a counterfeit insignia and carried identification using a different title. He was halted at a British border post near Bremen. Once they recognized him, he requested to address a leader. They inspected him and found a poison pill concealed within one of his molars. Prior to their intervention, he crunched it. He collapsed to the floor, bubbling at the lips. A steel decoration encased in parchment was discovered on his remains. Not a soul grieved his passing. Meanwhile, Wilhelm Keitel, commander of the military staff, endorsed the total capitulation in Reims. At 2:41 in the morning on the 7th of May, Germany stopped existing as a nation. The message traveled through a land that no longer paid attention. The boy recruits of the militia discarded their weapons. Females dangled pale linens from their frames in the highlands. Tiny bands of zealots persisted in combat until they depleted their gear, oblivious that there was nothing remaining to protect. The 8th of May was the initial day without commands. The paths were crowded with exiles, liberated captives, troops without markings, cadavers, and expired livestock. The partners located locomotives parked with cars filled with remains stacked high at Dachau and Buchenwald. The stench traveled for miles before the location. In a site near Munich, a youthful American commander wrote that it was impossible to inhale without feeling regret. Lenses recorded everything. Cinema reels would present those clips in theaters in London and New York weeks later. The world would observe the image of the Reich without disguise among the stacks of incinerated folders. The partners hunted for names, mandates, and signatures. Questioning started at once. At the Mondorf-les-Bains Center, a previous grand resort turned into a jail. The Nazi chiefs were kept under firm control. The units had toughened glass to thwart self-harm. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Kaltenbrunner, and 18 others were present. Every sunrise they were alerted at 6 o'clock. Every sunset their units were inspected 3 times. In the dining hall, Göring tried to keep army rules. Ribbentrop grumbled about the beverage. Speer quietly made entries. Keitel cried as he messaged his spouse. The interviews were conducted by doctors and secret agents who utilized German with clinical accuracy. They realized that not one of them felt themselves accountable. They all spoke in the distant past voice. It was mandated, it was settled. It was thought vital. Not one of them uttered "I." Only Göring confessed to having issued a command, but he did so with vanity, as if he were yet in the Parliament's grand seat. His pride kept him breathing. Meanwhile, the Soviets moved from the east, taking what stayed of Berlin. The metropolis was split into zones. In the bunker where Hitler had ended his life, Russian units located the ruler's traces, a deceased hound, and a handgun. Within days, Stalin mandated the remains be brought to Moscow. No one outside the Soviet circle would understand for certain what occurred to the traces until decades afterward. The partners started debating what to do with the detainees. Churchill desired to kill them without a hearing. Stalin asked for a model trial. The Americans pushed for a court. It was not just about retribution, but about proving that the offense could be identified and evaluated. The concept had to be fixed, that cruelty could be brought to law. The choice was both political and emblematic. The hearing would be conducted in Nuremberg, the town where Nazism had staged its biggest marches. In the summer of 1945, Nuremberg was a dark ruin. Coalition planes had ruined more than 90% of the town middle. The arena where Hitler had given his talks was filled with weeds and crowded with debris among the wreckage of the Zeppelin Plaza. A few youths played with gear and bits of clothes where thousands had formerly yelled, "Hail Victory!" Now only steps and the breeze could be detected. In this misery, American technicians fixed the Palace of Justice, the sole big structure that still possessed a ceiling. They toughened it with timber and power lines, fixed booths for linguists, and a sound setup. Courtroom 600 became the middle of the globe. The suspects were moved there by locomotive, bound under guard. Each was given a number. Göring was number 1, Hess number 2, Ribbentrop number 3. No one spoke during the trip. Outside, German hamlets observed the rail cars move by, doubtful whether to feel rage or comfort. During the path, a sentry noticed that the detainees seemed more curious about the food list than in their goal. On arrival, they were shut in lone units. The lamps stayed on 24 hours a day. The American sentries noted their every shift. Speer utilized hours writing in his journal. Stryker sketched pictures. Hess performed army drills on the tiles. Göring clashed with the jail chief about food sizes. Every night a priest moved the halls asking if anyone wished to confess. Nearly everyone said no. In the legal offices, crates of grabbed files were stacked tall. They were transport mandates, killing logs, health papers, messages from Goebbels. Every bit of parchment was around against the suspects. Linguists labored day and night. Some of these files would be displayed at the hearing as recorded proof. Others would be recited aloud in the flat tone of a speaker. But at that point, there were still no talks or lenses, only files, grime, and a thick quiet that signaled the noise of the hall that was soon to be created outside Germany. The world observed cinema reels presented detainees behind steel with words saying Hitler's group trapped. In the United States, journals printed drawings of Göring in his nightwear. In France, talks were held about whether law was viable after such terror. In Moscow, Stalin's rule was getting ready to join in a hearing where it would be both evaluator and partner. On the 18th of October, 1945, the charge was made known. The titles echoed for the initial time as signs of a shared malice. Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Funk, Schacht, Dönitz, Raeder, Schirach, Saukel, Jodl, Seyss-Inquart, Neurath, Fritzsche and Bormann, the latter in absence. None of them suspected that the hearing would be aired to the whole world, nor that their phrases would be carved in annals as those of the most watched judged individuals in recent times. Why Nuremberg? Nuremberg was in shambles. The town that had formerly been a sign of German pride and the floor for Nazi group gatherings was currently a frame draped in ash. The atmosphere smelled of grime and fuel. The paths where flag banners had made a sea of scarlet were now halls of debris hit by plumes of haze. In the Zeppelin Stadium, the rock rows were smashed and rusted gear, hollow tins and youth items were scattered among the scraps of signs. There were no birds, only the sound of the breeze between the blocks that had once heard Hitler's talks. There, where the leader had vowed a millennium of rule, coalition technicians were starting to gauge gaps for placing power lines. The Palace of Justice was the sole large structure that had outlasted with its frame whole. Its charred front looked like a burnt model of the past Reich. The Americans decided that this spot would be the middle of global law. Not by luck, the pick brought a point. The very place where Nazism had called itself forever would serve to evaluate its builders. Inside, the halls were grimy, but the blocks still showed the Reich's crest carved in rock. In one of the halls, staff cleared bits of glass and spikes, while specialists fixed tools, lamps, and a fast translation setup made just for the hearing. Shut booths of timber and plastic were set in each spot inside them. Linguists worked for hours moving between English, German, Russian, and French without stopping for air. The Americans brought miles of wires, lamps, lenses, sound recorders, and a speaker setup made to last weeks of talks. It was a moving task worthy of a conflict. Outside, British troops watched the edge while shooters and writers fought for the best spot among the ruins. German folks watched from a gap, confused by the show moving before them. Some thought it would be a public killing, others a media show. For many, Nuremberg stayed a sign of lost honor, and seeing its title linked with loss was another shame. The detainees were moved from Mondorf-les-Bains in tiny bands. The trip took 2 days. The locomotives were guarded by armed troops, and each car had only 3 or 4 steel units. The panes were shut with bars, and the chairs were traded for boards. None of them spoke. Göring, who was moving in the initial rail, asked for script paper. Hess stayed quiet through the path. Ribbentrop prayed low when the rail came to the ruined Nuremberg stop. Troops made a line as the suspects left one by one in the storm. The dirt was draped with sludge and ash. A few steps away, a band of writers took the initial shots. 21 men wet to the skin, wearing army wraps, being guarded toward a temporary court. The jail was right linked to the hall. Each unit had a tiny pane shut with mesh. The blocks were dark stone. The lamps were on all day. In the halls, the American sentries shifted every 3 hours. One of them wrote in his book that he had never seen such quiet in a spot with so much past. Göring was the first to land, asking for a second pad and the return of his band, which was refused. Hess slept with his lids open. Keitel tried to keep an army habit. He shaved, cleaned his boots, bent his sheet. Stryker spoke to himself, certain that he would soon be free. Speer saw every bit as if he were already making a book. In the food hall, the sentries made them sit apart. Each desk had 4 stools, but the suspects were never let to sit in bands of more than 3. The meal was basic: loaf, broth, and thin coffee. Göring kept a plan he made himself, certain that he had to show himself at the hearing in good shape. During the 15-minute gaps, they moved in a line under the sharp eye of 2 guards with guns. At times, the American priest went with them. Some spoke to him, others bypassed him. The linguists who served as speakers for the health talks said that the mood was one of total stress. No one knew how long the hearing would last, nor what proof stayed. Meanwhile, the town was getting ready to get the foreign guests. British, Soviet, French, and American leaders took half-ruined blocks, making offices with burnt desks and lamps found from the ruins at night. The buzz of power machines mixed with the sound of army rails still crossing the Waal. American leaders now slept in the past Deutsche Hof Hotel, where Hitler had stayed during group gatherings. In one of the spaces, a writer wrote that it still smelled of scent and wetness, as if the past had not quite perished. The day the coalition flags were lifted in front of the Palace of Justice, a band of German youths watched from the edge. They did not grasp what the hues meant for them. The whole world had fallen. Among the ruins in the town middle, old females searched for tiles to fix their pads. Men without limbs begged troops for smokes. Now and then, a British shooter took their shot. The images would travel to journals around the globe. German females with white scraps, hungry youths, coalition leaders taking gauges in front of fallen pillars. The conflict was done, but the view stayed same. Courtroom 600 took form in just a few weeks. The stools were rebuilt, Rows were fixed for writers, and a twin deck was built, one for the evaluators, the other for the accusers. The suspect's zone had 21 stools with single tools. Behind them, tough glass split the public. Wires crossed the floor in every path, and specialists checked the sets that would give live translation. It was a new feat of work. 4 tongues spoken at once, linked by a power setup that covered 2 floor levels. In one spot, a band of army doctors prepared talks to check the mental state of the suspects. They wanted to be sure that none of them killed themselves before the hearing. In the inner yard, orders in English and German mixed with the steel bang of doors every sunrise. The detainees lined up for name calls. Sometimes Göring greeted them with a bow. Other times he fought with the sentries over small bits. One sunrise he asked to be let to shave with his own blade, but was denied. He tried to pay a troop with a clock without luck. In the days leading to the hearing, he was happy. He said he could still win over the world, that the cause had not been a crime, but a lost idea. The others heard in quiet. The mood inside the palace was mixed. Outside, writers were setting up lenses and wires in the frost. Inside, sentries were doing the steps as if they were a play. Every stool had a tag, every tool a number. The accusers were quietly doing their talks, checking the sound of the space. A few shooters were let in with special cards to record the tests. The lamps were so strong they warmed the room. Shadows were cast on the blocks like ghosts. On the 18th of November, 2 days before the hearing started, the suspects were led into the hollow hall for the initial time. They moved in a line, bound, guarded by armed troops. Göring grinned with the same look he used before the lenses of the Reich. Keitel moved with his head low. Ribbentrop looked at the ceiling. Speer seemed to be mental, gauging the gap between the past and this broken now. They sat in the zone. No one spoke. Only the sound of the lamps could be heard. The sentries watched them in quiet. For a minute, history seemed to stop air. Outside, the town clocks hit 5 o'clock in the day, and a band of writers was writing the line the world would read the next day. Nuremberg, the stage for the hearing of the century, is ready. The invention of modern law, the sunrise of the 20th of November, 1945, was cold in Nuremberg. At 9:30, the sound of the steel doors smashed the quiet. The suspects entered in a line. Göring, chin held tall, led the band. Behind him moved Hess, stiff, not looking at anyone. Ribbentrop crossed himself before sitting down past the tough glass. Writers and watchers waited to see something people had never seen. A hearing against the builders of a global conflict. When the main evaluator, the Briton Geoffrey Lawrence, hit the wood, history shifted its tongue. For the first time, the winners were not killing the losers. They were calling them to answer to the law of 4 powers. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union shared the same row. It was a bond made by victory filled with doubts. The Soviets asked for death, the British care, the French repair, and the Americans legal truth. A light balance hung between law and revenge. Accuser Robert H. Jackson got up with slow steps. He wore a dark robe, his face hard, his voice firm. He looked at the suspects and spoke with a calm that cooled the hall. This hearing, he said, was not an act of hate, but a sign that power could no longer be a reason for crime. The conflict of aggression was the top crime of the century. His talk at once moved into 4 tongues, echoed with sounds that seemed to own no land. Göring scowled. Hess took off his sets. During the first few days, the accusers showed piles of files, messages, signed orders, logs having Reich marks. The evaluators heard without a shift. Typewriters banged non-stop. Lenses moved in the back. The proof piled up, making a paper view. The world read the titles of the suspects as if they were parts of the same ruin. The court's rule had made a new tongue: crimes against humanity, plot to wage conflict, single duty for acts of nation. These were new ways to tell what had no name. In the offices on the top floor, linguists and law experts searched for same words between tongues that did not even share the same idea of law. For the Soviets, it meant revenge. For the British, legal rule. For the French, moral fix. For the Americans, proof of culture. All these views had to join into one voice. As the days moved, the hall turned into a 20th century lab. Screens started showing clips of the camps, piles of bodies, open fires, faces that were no longer faces. Some evaluators looked away. The suspects stayed still. Ribbentrop hid his face. Göring said something to his aide. Speer lowered his head for a bit. The law faded into quiet. There was no law for this. Morality and legal logic spoke distinct tongues. The words duty, task, and nation lost their mass in the face of the files. The court found that evil could be written in a note signed in blue ink and filed with a state mark. Each bit of paper wiped an excuse when the clips of Majdanek were shown. The public held its air. Surprise appeared on Göring's face. Hess grinned. Speer bowed his head again. At night, the accusers kept working among lit lamps and cups of cold coffee. In a side space, Jackson talked with his team the limits of law, whether it should hit or teach. The Soviets pushed on, calling the Katyn killing a German crime, despite knowing it was their own act. No one said it, but the mood was one of doubt. Each power brought its own truth, its own dead, and its own guilt. In the halls, the speakers moved with tired eyes. Fast translation was a technical wonder and a test of grit. Every phrase had to be grasped, changed, and given back without flaw. A single slip could shift the result of a verdict. Some speakers ended up in bed from drain. Without them, the hearing simply would not have occurred. History was told through thin wires and voices that barely stayed up. As the weeks moved, the task took on tool-like speed. The proof went by like a list of terror. Maps of the Reich shown again and again, dates, names, units. Under that office skin, the evaluators knew they were making a new form of law built on the ruins of conflict. Every sunrise started the same. The sound of boots on the dirt, orders in 4 tongues, shooters firing at once. In German towns, crowds met around broken radios to hear the reports. The words crimes against humanity seemed hard to grasp, but the clips were not. For the initial time, people had a face. Jackson and Lawrence's talks set the tone for the hearing. There was no rage, but a gauged gap. The goal was not to ruin the guilty, but to prove that the law could win over guns. But the irony was clear. The winners were evaluating the losers by rules they themselves had just written. The suspects knew this. No one will evaluate the coalition for Dresden or Hiroshima, Göring said during gaps. The court did not answer. The logic was no longer one of balance, but of making a model. Who were the suspects? The row looked like a gallery of faces from a breaking empire. Each figure was a part of the rule. Desire, zeal, duty, rot. To the left sat Hermann Göring, still showing the air of a man who had ruled half of Europe. His dark outfit, without marks, stayed clean in the early days. He grinned at the writers, fixed his necktie, and took notes as if he were a guest of honor. During gaps, he spoke with the sentries about his time in the Air Force, giving numbers, dates, wins. He truly thought he could still move the court. He said he had served Germany, not Hitler. Through the hearing, every move was a try to keep a rank that was gone. Beside him, Rudolf Hess sat still, his look hollow. He had spent years in jail in England after his failed flight to Scotland. No one knew if he was faking madness or had truly lost his mind. When asked his title, he said, "I don't recall." During the talks, he would look into space, his lips moving in quiet. Some days he would suddenly get up and yell odd phrases about the state of the Reich. The doctors could not agree. Was it faking or sickness? To the folks, he was a drawing of an idea that had eaten itself. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the rules agent, was another show. He had gone from meeting kings and envoys to facing speakers and evaluators who would not even look at him. His hair was very neat. He took notes in old books, marking words. His defense was that of a clerk who had never fired a gun. He said he had obeyed the leader like everyone else, that his name did not kill anyone, but the files showed he had settled moves and signed bonds with the blood of millions. When shown the move orders for Jews from Hungary and France, he shook and looked at the tiles. Further on, Wilhelm Keitel, head of the army, stood stiff. Every move was that of a troop still waiting for orders. His hat sat on his knees. He stood up whenever an evaluator called his title during questions. He spoke in a low, polite voice. He confessed to signing bad orders, but pushed that he could not refuse. When asked if he grasped the gap between duty and crime, he said, "A troop has no morals of his own." That phrase was kept in the logs as a sign for a whole age of troops beside him. Alfred Jodl, his aide, took notes with the care of a clerk. Julius Streicher was the total opposite. The past editor of the hate journal, The Stormer, acted like a wild priest. During the talks, he made drama moves, yelled slurs, and denied all. In the gaps, he said prayers and spoke of himself as a victim. The sentries watched him with disgust. He looked like a man eaten by zeal. The court read his works full of hate and bad drawings and needed no more proof in him. One saw the mean face of hate, that of those who never used a gun but who fed the fires. Albert Speer, the builder of the Reich, was distinct. His look was calm, nearly studied. He spoke in a fair tone, owned his guilt, and gave numbers. He was the only one who showed regret. He said that the setup they had built was a heartless tool and that he had been a part of it. The accusers heard him with doubt. His brain made him risky. He tried to save himself with words, turning his confession into a plan. At night, he wrote thoughts in a book he kept under his pad. He was the only one who grasped that history would be written after the hearing and that his part rested on how he told his own fall. Karl Dönitz, the final German chief of nation, showed himself as a seaman, far from politics. His defense was that of a leader who followed orders at sea. He denied any news of the Holocaust, pushing that his conflict was against coalition ships. But files showed his part in the continuation of the conflict after Hitler's death. His face showed a mix of tired and pride. When the sinking of folks' ships was told, he said flatly, "They were fair goals." Hans Frank, the boss of Held Poland, came to the hearing, a ghost figure. He had lost mass, his white hair falling. He showed up with a Bible in his hand and said lines. In his first talks, he tried to reason his part in the terror. Then he broke down in tears. In his unit, he wrote, "Thousands died due to me." His regret seemed real, but it did not shift his lot. For the accusers, his change was too late. For the writers, he was a sign of German guilt. Fritz Sokol, in charge of forced work, stood for cruelty without gloss. He had watched the move of millions of slave staff in court. He defended himself, saying it was not his direct task. When shown lists of captives moved to shops under his rule, he said, "It was a command." The speakers noted the dry tone in which he said those 4 words. None of the suspects seemed to grasp that the world had shifted. In the back row, Baldur von Schirach, head of the youth, was calm. He owned his part in the mental shaping of German youth, but said he had been fooled by Hitler. His soft way was different from the pride of others. Doctors said he was the only one who could think without spite. Beside him, Hjalmar Schacht, the rules bankman, was fighting with his aide about money bits. His partial free verdict would be one of the few shocks of the hearing. The row was not just a list of titles, it was a whole image of the Third Reich army heads. Clerks, thinkers, specialists, and media men shared the same space, breathing the same air. Sometimes they looked at each other with hate. Göring still thought himself their boss. Speer bypassed him. Streicher hated him. During gaps, the quiet between them was more vocal than any talk. As the sessions went on, their faces grew old. Mass loss, lack of sleep, endless questions, and the stress turned the high leaders into ghosts. Some sought refuge in giving up, others in pride. Göring spoke of how he would rebuild Germany if he were free. Keitel begged that his kin not be hunted. Hess stayed in his own hollow world. When the talks ended, the sentries led them in a line to their units. The sound of the doors shutting marked the end of each day like the strike of a tool in the global press. Photos of the row went around like clips from a church rite. 21 men who had led one of the most deadly tools in history now looked like captives listening to their lot. Some Germans saw them as beasts, others as victims. But all grasped that this image was final. Total power had ended. What stayed was a wood deck, a tool, and the slow ruin of the leader myth through the faces that had served him in Nuremberg. The Nazi rule did not die from a shot, but from a question. The start of the hearing, the show of quiet. On the 20th of November, 1945, at 10 o'clock sharp, the sentries opened the doors of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. Outside, frost fell on a town dark from ruins. Inside, all was set. Gauged tools, lenses moving, sets lined up, clocks matched. Writers filled the rows. The air was thick, warmed by the lamps. In the shut booths, speakers fixed their sets with shaking hands. No one knew what was going to occur, but everyone felt they were about to see something unique. The suspects entered one by one, bound under the hard look of the coalition troops. Göring was the first to sit with the ease of an actor coming back to the deck. Hess, pale, sat in quiet. Keitel, stiff, snapped to attention. Ribbentrop wiped the sweat from his brow. Stryker said prayers. Behind them, tough glass split the public. Agents, writers, army folks. In the front row, a young American leader turned on his tape tool. The court got up. The main evaluator, Jeffrey Lawrence, hit the wood. The whole hall stood. In the booths, voices started to grow in 4 tongues. Sets hummed, English, French, Russian, German. The sound of fans mixed with the sounds of history. Then U.S. accuser Robert H. Jackson rose. He moved to the bench, opened his files, and waited a few seconds. No one breathed. He spoke without moves, his voice firm and firm. He said that people, for the first time, were evaluating those who had led them to the pit, that the law would set a model. That total power should never again be mixed with logic. Each line was at once copied in the sets. Each gap echoed like a quiet sound. Göring crossed his arms, a grin moving on his lips. Hess lowered his head. Speer watched him close like one seeing the fall of a frame. The lenses recorded every move. The harsh lamps turned the air into a pale haze. The typewriters moved, marking the beat of the steps. Jackson listed the charges: plot, crimes against peace, conflict crimes, crimes against humanity. He read the titles one by one. Göring lifted his chin when he heard his. Stryker moved his head. Only Speer seemed to pull back. Then the proof started. Folders, maps, messages, killing orders, move lists were read. Rules for work camps. When the court ordered the first clips to be shown, the whole hall held its air. Clips taken in the new freed camps showed on the screen. Dachau, Belsen, Buchenwald. Piles of bodies, open fires, troops in masks moving through huts. No one shifted. The speakers stopped talking. A lensman cried behind the glass. Göring shut his eyes for what seemed a long time. Keitel held his hands. Ribbentrop hid his face. Stryker watched without a blink. When the clip ended, the quiet lasted a full minute. Only when Lawrence said a gap did the typewriters start their sound again. Outside, writers were sending to their journals, "The world has seen what it did not want to see." The next days went with tool speed every sunrise. The captives were led in a line from their units to the hall. Checks, sets, move. At 8, food. At 9 o'clock, getting ready. At 10, the talk coffee was banned. Mail read. The world watched, moved and scared. The show of the losers, hearing their own guilt. In the rows, writers wrote non-stop. The Frenchman Raymond Cartier wrote that the hearing had the weight of a mass and the cold of a lab. Soviet watchers stayed quiet, taking notes. Speakers were tired after hours of work. Some defense aides fell under the stress. At one talk, Ribbentrop's aide yelled that this was not law, but play. Jackson did not answer. The hearing continued. The files became guns. Each bit of paper read showed a lie. Germans, hearing the radio reports, started to doubt all. Photos of the camps were put on the blocks of Berlin and Hamburg. The hearing no longer just judged 21 men. It broke the shared dream of purity inside the hall. The suspects' ways were part of the show. Göring gave notes to his peers with a grin. Keitel stayed stiff, even while seated. Stryker looked at the evaluators with hate. Hess seemed gone, laughing to himself. Speer, the hard watcher, saw the scene as if making a model. During a gap, he said to his aide, "This is not just a hearing, it is the end of German politics." The coalition accusers were matched with army speed each day. A new set of proof, army files, meeting notes, killing logs. The Soviets showed their clips from the East Front. Burnt hamlets, hanging bodies, ruined towns. The British gave intel reports, the French move lists. The hearing became a study of the crime, cut by nations that could barely like each other. The public shifted from day to day, agents, leaders, survivors. Some cried at the clips, others looked with hate. At one talk, a previous Ravensbrück captive fell on seeing the clips. As the sentries took her out, the evaluators did not stop the reading. At night, the suspects went back to their units. Doctors wrote their reactions. Göring spoke of plan. Keitel wrote to his spouse. Streicher wrote bad drawings. Speer thought that the court was building a new morale on the ruins of the Reich. In the food hall, a steel quiet lived, broken only by the sound of spoons. Outside the palace, Nuremberg was still draped in haze. American troops moved among the ruins. Youths begged shooters for smokes. In the pubs, the coalition drank warm beer and talked of the hearing as if it were a film. No one thought that these talks would last nearly a year. In Courtroom 600, the conflict went on in another form. It was no longer tanks or planes, but files, photos, clips, and words. History bled itself out in tongue. The suspects grew old before the lenses. Göring had gained mass. Hess was losing it. Speer's hair was turning grey. Only the clock on the bench marked the true count of time. The slow, hard move of loss. When the court stopped that first day, the suspect stood. Göring gave a small bow to the evaluator. Hess grinned. Shooters caught the point. One of those clips would become a sign of the hearing. 21 men in a row, lost, but still standing tall before a world that for the initial time was trying to name evil. Outside, the breeze moved across the ruins of Nuremberg, and the sound of Lawrence's wood seemed to still echo off the blocks like a shot that had not quite hit yet. The hearings of hell. By the end of December 1945, the hall habit had become a fast machine. Every sunrise at 6 o'clock, the sentries opened the units, the suspects lined up, and moved down the hall lit by long lamps. The sound of boots echoed in the way like a beat. On reaching Courtroom 600, the lamps were already on, and the public waited in quiet. The evaluators took their stools, and the accusers set piles of folders. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of paper, sweat, and the hot steel of the lamps. What was about to be shown was no longer talks or files, but the most hard proof of the century. The first test clip took place on a dark sunrise. The staff set up a pale screen behind the deck. Wires crossed the floor, and a specialist checked the tool's sound. When the lamps went down, the hum of the tool filled the room. On the screen showed clips filmed by the coalition during the freeing of the camps. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. Piles of bodies, hollow faces, captives who looked like ghosts. There was no sound or talk, only the tool sound of the film. For many minutes, no one moved. Some evaluators lowered their look. The speakers held their hands over the tools. The suspects seemed stuck in spot. Göring watched with firm lips. Hess grinned in fear. Keitel hid his face. Streicher said odd phrases. Speer watched without a blink. A sentry later said that he had never felt such total quiet. The court ordered more clips to be shown, the digging of the mass pits, the talks of those freed, the youths with numbers marked on their arms. The public could not take the clips. Some writers left the room. Others wrote without looking, their hands shaking. An American shooter cried behind his lens. The wires of the translation setup shook with the stress of a block that held more pain than it could take. After each clip, the accusers read files, signed rules, killing orders, health logs, messages with numbers. The titles of the camps were told like a song. The words how death had been done with office tongue. No one could act as if they did not know. The next questions were colder. The accusers asked for answers, and the suspects sought refuge in army tongue. I was doing orders. I did not know the bits. It was needed for the conflict. Goring tried to lead the speed of the steps, breaking in, fixing words, grinning with pride. When the British accuser faced him about the moves of Jews from Hungary, he said, "I did not order those acts." It was Himmler's task. The line hung in the air, hollow. The evaluators did not answer. The files spoke for themselves. A letter signed by Kaltenbrunner told the count of killings at the Mauthausen camp in 1 week, 3,600. Another report told the delivery of Zyklon B gas to Auschwitz, with the date, count, and goal. The court clerk read each line in a flat voice behind him. The public held its air. The suspects looked forward, still. Only Speer took notes. In January, the Soviet accuser's office showed proof of crimes done on the East Front. The files were marked with the red star. Photos taken in Ukraine and Belarus were shown. Burnt hamlets, bodies on trees, youths shot in pits. The Russian accusers spoke in dark voices while the speakers struggled to keep up. The words fell over each other: ruin, revenge, killing. The line between law and media was blurred, but the terror was real. The witnesses started to go past. On the stand, under the pale glare of the lamps, showed the camp survivors, a Polish rabbi, a French doctor, a Czech female. They told what they had seen in a raw tone. The female told how ice-cold water had been put into her veins during a health test. The doctor told how he had worked without drug on orders from the SS. Each talk was moved at once, and the words going through 4 tongues seemed to grow the pain. In the row, no one answered. The hall started to fill with folks every day. Writers told the suspects' reactions in the journals as if they were actors in a slow, bad show. Goring stayed the main man. He held his arms, took notes, spoke to his aide. Stryker moved. Keitel cried once. On hearing the reading of the killing orders for Soviet captives, Speer stood still, his look on the floor. The coalition accusers fought in their care. The British gave intel reports on the bombing of Poland. The French move lists to Drancy and the camps in the east. The Soviets proof of mass ruin in Minsk and Smolensk. The Americans showed the logs of the Reich ministry with the marks whole and the names of the suspects. The files were stacked in rows that looked like walls of paper. The evaluators looked spent. Some took notes slow, others just watched. The air was hard. The speakers worked to the point of drain. At night, the speakers slept on their desks, draped by wires and sets. The hearing went with tool speed, without mercy. In the units, the suspects acted in new ways. Goring stayed sure, certain he could move the steps. He told the sentries that the court was just a show to reason the coalition win. Hess laughed to himself and said phrases about plots. Keitel, getting thinner by the day, begged to be let to confess to the priest. Speer spent his nights writing notes he titled Thoughts on Guilt. Outside the court, the paths of Nuremberg were still draped in dirty frost. The fallen pillars of the past Nazi gatherings stood like ruins from a distinct world. The townsfolk barely spoke of the hearing. Some went to the palace gates to look at the accusers' cars. Others just moved past. For many Germans, the steps were a show of shared shame. As the months went on, the proof grew to a near-endless mass. Lenses ran day and night. Talks, rules, books, army orders, and meeting notes were checked. Hitler's words echoed like ghosts. The hearing had become a study of the Reich's tool, shown part by part. On paper, the killing showed as a fast setup with names, marks, and dates. One day, the French accuser showed a file found in the logs of the Ministry of Economy, a table listing the money worth of the goods taken from moved Jews: watches, rings, teeth, human hair. The quiet that followed was heavier than any talk. At that point, the evaluators grasped that they were evaluating something that went past conflict, a group that had turned crime into an office habit. Judge Lawrence stopped the session without a word. The sentries led the suspects to their units. Outside, lamps lit the front of the hall like a left theater deck. The town was still draped in ruins, but inside that block, hell had been shown with office speed. There, under the pale lamps and the steel sound of the tools, horror had taken the form of a file. The battle of words. By the start of 1946, the hearing had already turned into a war of words. Images of terror had been shown, files read, names shown. What stayed was a fight of tongue, the suspects against the accusers. Army logic against civil moral, the talk of the Reich against the mass of the proof. Every sunrise as the sentries opened the units, Göring smoothed his hair, fixed his jacket, and grinned as if he were about to enter a talk. On the way to Courtroom 600, he crossed himself and said, "Today I speak." The hall was a theatre without cheers. Accusers checked files, evaluators stayed still, and the public leaned in. The defense tried the impossible to reason the bad. The German aides, most of them set by the coalition, searched for holes in the law frame. They said that the rules did not exist when the crimes were done, that the suspects acted under orders, that conflict was by nature an act of force, and that hitting the losers was fake. The plan was cold and gauged to plant doubt, to turn guilt into a technical bit. Göring was the first to speak. He spoke for hours. His voice moved through the speakers, shifting between pride and memory. He denied ordering killings, denied knowing the bits of the camps, and denied all direct task. He said that Nazism had been a shield against communism, and that the conflict was a first move. He looked at the evaluators with a sharp grin, and every line sounded practiced. His speech was fast, mean. Jackson faced him with files, but Göring stayed up, firing off sharp answers. At one point, when the accuser blamed him of having ruined freedom, he said, "And what freedom?" "The one you ruined with the Treaty of Versailles." The hall held its air. Judge Lawrence told him to be quiet, but it was too late. Göring had done what he wanted to turn the hearing into a fight. The other suspects followed his model, though without his skill. Keitel broke down while saying that he had obeyed orders as a German troop should. When the accuser asked him if he grasped that these orders meant shooting unarmed captives, Keitel lowered his head and said it was needed to keep order. Jodl, his aide, tried to tell of the blitzkrieg with charts. No one grasped the point. Streicher yelled from his stool, slurring the evaluators, calling Göring a rat and Speer a liar. His aide begged him to be quiet, but he said that only God could evaluate him. Albert Speer, on the other hand, chose a new way. He did not deny the crimes, he read them. He said the rule had been a setup of spread duty, a web of duty where no one knew all, but everyone knew some. He spoke calm with gauged lines. He owned his moral guilt, not his legal guilt. He was the only one who asked for mercy, not to save himself, but to gap himself from the rest. His talk moved the court. The accusers did not know if they were seeing a real confession or a smart move. Speer had grasped that regret could be a gun. The hearing became a game. Every word was a piece. The accusers threw questions like hits. The suspects answered with army speed. The line, "We were doing orders," was told so much it lost its sense. The evaluators, spent, noted the same things day after day. Denial, move, less. Sometimes the hall looked like a school, other times a trench. The air was thick with stress. During a gap, a speaker fell from drain. He had been moving between German and English for 3 days straight without sleep. Jackson, aware that Göring ruled the steps, decided to shift plans during his final talk. He faced him with a file dated 1941, an order to move the Jews to the east. Göring saw his name, but pushed it was a mere office bit. Jackson looked him in the eye and said, "You did not just sign orders. You signed the lot of millions." Göring lowered his look. It was the only time he lost his cool. In the row, the other suspects watched him in quiet, as if for the initial time they grasped that tongue no longer shielded them. The next days were a run of plans and falls. Ribbentrop tried to rebuild his image by talking of deals, meals, and courts. The evaluators broke him with move lists he had signed. Frank, the boss of Poland, said with tears and begged mercy from the Jews. He said he deserved to die. Streicher stood up and yelled that he was lying. Sentries had to take him out. Hess stayed in his hollow world, writing odd notes in his book. The mood was hard. Speakers fell. Evaluators barely spoke. The sound of typewriters was the music of the hearing. Every word said was turned into a log, A file, history. Writers called the steps the paper war. All of people seemed to be recorded in notes. The fights among the coalition accusers grew. The Soviets wanted hard deaths. The Americans sought law truth. The French asked for moral sign. And the British tried to keep cool in the halls. Speakers heard talks about how to evaluate what had never been evaluated before. No one said it loud, but everyone knew that the hearing was also a power fight among the winners inside the hall. The suspects were starting to split. Göring stayed the boss, but Speer and Chirac were growing far. At night in their units, the fights were hard. Göring said the court would be mocked. Speer said that the Reich had already fallen. Keitel prayed low. Streicher yelled from his unit until the sentries cut the lamp. As the weeks moved, the defenses started to break. Words were no longer enough to deny, only to try to grasp. The court had heard so many reasons that the truth became back sound. The evaluators started cutting short, long talks. No more history, Lawrence said one day, just facts. But the facts were hard to take. The judged men lived in a state of still stress, aware that each sunrise could be their last. The sentries moved in quiet through the halls. The lamps stayed on all night, and the air was thick with a mix of smoke, wet, and soap. Göring kept his army look, always clean, shaven, always neat. He set his files, wrote letters, and continued to speak with power, as if he still led an invisible army. Keitel spent hours praying, holding a faith that seemed his last spot. Hess stayed shut in his world of dreams, saying odd lines. Streicher yelled in the nights, yelling names and slurs, while the others ignored him. Speer, on the other hand, stayed calm. He read, wrote, thought as if thought were a form of grit. Time had lost all sense, clocks were banned, and days were gauged by the sentry's steps and the far sounds of the ruined town. Talks were few and short. Sometimes during gaps, someone would mention their kin or an old fight. Priest Henry Gericke moved among the units with his Bible, trying to give comfort. Some heard him, others, like Göring or Streicher, hated him. At night, the quiet was so heavy that the captives' air could be heard through the blocks. Each waited for the end in their own way, with giving up, with faith, with pride, or with madness. But they all shared the same truth. The world had judged them long before the evaluators said their titles, the verdict and the deaths. On the sunrise of the 1st of October, 1946, the Nuremberg hall was draped in an odd calm. There were no sounds of planes, only the low voice of the public waiting outside the block. Inside, sentries stood in two lines along the hall leading to Courtroom 600. The suspects were brought in one by one, bound without any contact with one another. None of them spoke. The lamps lit since sunrise made the air seem thick. Outside, the sky was a steel grey, the same shade as the sentries' clothes. At 10 o'clock, Judge Lawrence ordered the steps to start. On the bench, the speakers put on their sets. Writers filled the rows. The accusers waited with their folders lined up. The suspects seated on the wood row looked like stone faces. Göring with a calm face. Keitel pale. Jodl still. Hess gone. Speer with his hands held. Streicher stared at the public with a mix of rage and dare. The quiet was total as Lawrence started to read the verdict. His voice sounded steel through the speakers. Each word was a line that landed like a heavy hit. The court saw the existence of a crime plot, the plan of a conflict of aggression, the hard breach of global bonds, and the killing of folk groups. It was the first time in history that law had served a global scale. The first title was Hermann Göring, guilty on all 4 counts. Conflict crimes, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and plot, judged to death by hanging. Göring stayed still, then he moved his head a bit, like one getting an army order. Behind him, Hess grinned for no clear reason. Keitel guilty. Jodl guilty. Ribbentrop guilty. Streicher guilty. Frank guilty. Frick guilty. Kaltenbrunner guilty. Sokol guilty. Rosenberg guilty. Seyss-Inquart guilty. Speer guilty of 2 counts, free of the others, judged to 20 years in jail. Schacht and Fritzsche free. Bormann judged in absence to death. Each title was read with a ritual beat. The speakers told it in English, French, Russian, and German. The voices grew like a sound that echoed through the room. The public barely breathed. Some writers had tears in their eyes. The evaluators kept their faces still. There was no cheers, only the weight of the day. Göring was the only one who spoke. When the judge asked him if he wished to make a final talk, he said in a loud voice, "History will evaluate us differently." No one answered. He was led from the hall by 2 sentries, moving with a goal. Keitel tried an army bow before leaving, but the sentries held his arm. Stryker yelled, "Hail Hitler," before his mouth was shut. Speer bowed his head and left without looking at anyone. That night, the jail fell quiet. The sentries got orders for hard watch. In every unit, pads, items, books, and drugs were searched. Göring had asked to speak with priest Gericke. The priest found him calm, smoking. "I do not fear hit," he said. "I fear shame." Then he asked him to pray for Germany, not for himself. The deaths were set for the 16th of October. Until then, the judged men stayed in lone units. Göring kept writing notes in his book with blue ink. Keitel asked for a way to confess his sins. The sentries gave it. Jodl wrote a note to his spouse that never hit her. Stryker stayed mad, hitting on his unit door and yelling odd prayers. Speer from his next unit heard without a word. On the eve of his death, Göring called the priest. He got him in his jail gown. He said he would not die by hanging like a mean culprit. Gericke tried to calm him, but Göring grinned. That same night, a sentry found his body on his bed. He had eaten a poison pill. No one knew how he got it. In his hand was a note. "They will not take away my way of dying." At 2 o'clock the next sunrise, the rite started. In the death space, lit by lamps, the American troops waited for orders. The killer, Sergeant John C. Woods, wore dark gloves one by one. The judged men were led to the wood. Keitel was the first. He went up the steps with slow moves. He bowed and said, "Long live Germany." The sharp sound of the door echoed through the room. Then came Jodl. He said in a firm voice, "My soul to God, my life to my land." Stryker was the most wild. He yelled slurs, fought, and before falling managed to say, "Purim Festival 1946, a look to the Jewish Day of Divine Pay." The sentries pulled him away. His death was slow. The killer pulled the rope and lowered his look. There were no rites or songs, only the sound of the ropes and the sound of steps on the wood floor. When it was all done, there was total quiet. The bodies were put in marked boxes and taken in hidden trucks to a near fire spot. The ash was spread in a river. None of the judged men were given a pit. Writers were not let to go. The state story was short. The act has been done. At dawn, priest Gericke moved down the hollow hall. The unit doors were open. The sentries smoked in quiet. In Göring's unit, the air still smelled of nuts. On the desk lay his last scripts, loose lines, a photo of his spouse, and a sheet of paper with one word: honor. Outside, the town was slow waking up. Bells rang far away. In courtroom 600, the rows stayed hollow, the lamps on. The speakers had put away their sets, the accusers their folders, the evaluators their robes. The world had turned the page. But in that room of wood and stone, the sound of the words that had tried to tell the hard still lived. The hearing was done, but not the mass of what it had shown. In the logs, the files stayed piled high in thousands of folders. Every name, every order, every talk became proof of the biggest moral fall. The men had been brought to law, but all of people were told to recall.